Good morning. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all so very much for joining us, and thank you all for your ongoing support of the Council Town Hall. Please check out our website at lawac.org to see how you can support continuing quality programming by becoming a member, making a contribution, or consider becoming a sponsor of one of our live streams. It is now my pleasure to introduce politics professor Dan Schnur and his weekly program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Dan has three interesting topics today. The first is the America First campaign, isolationism on the campaign trail. Second, are race relations in California improving? New poll data has the answer. And third, the morning headlines, news from the front page, and boy, is there a lot. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we will be taking questions in about 20 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. And Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program. As always, she'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. Dan, can't wait for today's discussion. Let me turn it over to you.
Kim, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. As Kim said, we do have a lot to discuss today and certainly a lot in the news. So what I'm actually going to do is pull a fast one on Kim and reverse the order of the topics that she referenced just a moment ago, because the news of the day, frankly, the news of the week, the resurgence of the COVID-19 virus here in California and around the country is justifiably dominating public and media conversation. So we're going to start with that and then go on to a discussion about race relations and ultimately to talking about isolationism on the presidential campaign trail. So first of all, let's start by talking about COVID. And what we're going to do today is, rather than focus on the broader crisis, because that's something we talk about on a fairly regular basis, today we're going to zero in a little bit and talk about the disproportionate effect of the pandemic on minority communities, on communities of color in this country. As we've discussed before, more broadly, the continued spread of the coronavirus and the failure of our country to get the virus under control is a failure of leadership, but it's also a failure of followership. And as some of you may have heard, as most of you probably heard, just earlier this week, Robert Redfield, the director of the Center for Disease Control, he said that if every one of us, if every single American wore masks, this whole thing would be done in between 4 to 8 weeks. Obviously, we're not doing that, and so it's not over. According to the most recent Axios poll, we are now up to respondents saying 62% of them are wearing masks. And I think we can agree that those numbers are slightly exaggerated, but even if they're not, that means that less than 2/3 of Americans are wearing a mask on a regular basis. And so if we do want to get this under control the way Robert Redfield suggests, we're a long way away from doing so. But as I mentioned a moment ago, today let's start out by talking about the impact specifically of COVID-19 on communities of color, which has been particularly devastating in both blue states and red. So for example, there was a study done out of the CDC that just came out this past week that talked about 2 rural counties in the state of Arkansas, way up in the northwest corner of the state, hard on the Texas border, Benton County and Washington County. So the logical question is why should you care? Unless you live in or near northwest Arkansas, why should you care about Benton or Washington County? Because and I'll tell you why, because the CDC study showed that in these 2 counties, Latinos, Hispanic Americans, make up just 17% of the population, but comprise more than 45%, almost half of the reported cases of the virus. Pacific Islanders are just 1.5% of the population there, but represent roughly 20% of the cases and 38% of the deaths. Now, those are just 2 isolated examples in rural Arkansas, but let's broaden the picture and look at this disparity from a national perspective. Nationally, across the United States, it's been reported that Latino and African Americans are 3 times as likely to become infected as white Americans are. 3 times as likely to become infected as whites. And individuals from those two communities are roughly twice as likely to die from the virus as white people. Now, because the white population in America and elsewhere is somewhat older than in communities of color, within certain age groups, that disparity is even greater. There's a new Harvard analysis of the National Center for Health Statistics, and they offer the following data. They said Latinos aged 35 to 54, have a coronavirus mortality rate nearly 8 times higher than white people in that same age group, 35 to 44. And African Americans in that age range have a mortality rate 9 times higher than white people. If you go to a slightly younger age group, the numbers get a little bit better, but not much. Among Latinos aged 25 to 34, the coronavirus mortality rate is about 5 times that of whites. And there's all sorts of reasons for this disparity. Many of them are socioeconomic. The average income level in many of these communities is significantly lower among African American and Latino Americans than among the white population. And what that means is it's much more likely that a resident of these communities is going to have a lack of ongoing access to quality health care even before the pandemic. What that means is that there's much more frequent examples of pre-existing conditions that lower protections against the disease. Because of those same economic challenges, African American and Latino Americans are much more likely to live in very crowded living circumstances. And they're much more likely to hold jobs that require an in-person presence. So the percentages of telecommuting are much higher in the white community than communities of color. And even for those who don't get the virus, the impacts of the disease are disproportionate among African Americans and Latinos. Job losses as a result of the virus are much greater in retail and service sectors. And the LA Times reports this morning, I'd recommend the story if you didn't see it, on the extremely large learning disparities that occurred during the spring once the schools in this area shut down because of lack of access in minority communities to ongoing internet service, to regular internet service, and therefore a much lower rate of participation among students from these communities. So segueing into our second topic, our race relations in California improving, I think we can use the data that I've just shared as sort of a construct, a way to reflect on the environment in which this new poll was taken. Because not surprisingly, voters of color are much more cautious and much more pessimistic about the path forward. Now, let me tell you a little bit about this poll. I had the great privilege of working this spring with a coalition made up of the Los Angeles Urban League, which is the largest African American community organization in Southern California, the organization HOPE, which stands for Hispanos Organized for Political Equality, and the community organization CAUSE, the Center for Asians United for Self-Empowerment. Together, these three organizations representing three different communities combined to do a series of polls, the first in February, before the pandemic, before the tragic death of George Floyd, and before the resulting protests and demonstrations, and then went out and did a second poll in late June, early July, in which we sampled the entire state of California, did an oversample to dig deeper among residents of these communities, among African American Californians, among Latinos, and among members of the Asian Pacific community. So what did we find? Well, on questions of schools reopening, questions of economy and health, and on other policy matters, we found, as I mentioned earlier, that the respondents from minority communities were much more cautious and much more pessimistic. They were much less likely to support schools reopening in person, much less likely to support businesses reopening, and much more likely to believe that the worst still lay ahead, both for themselves individually and for the state as a whole. So we could spend the better part of this hour on this particular survey, but there's one policy area in which I wanted to make sure that we focused, and that's the area of police reform. So we asked our respondents of all races and ethnicities the same question that we're just about to ask you. So Claire, if you wouldn't mind putting up the first question for our group. The question we asked them, and which we're asking you now, is which of the following comes closest to your view about the police in California? Number one, should we abolish the police departments altogether and shift funding and responsibilities to community and social service organizations? Number two, should we shift some funds from the police, but have the police departments continue to play the primary role in handling violent crime matters, even if we shift funding for social service programs elsewhere? Third, should we focus instead not on shifting funds and on lessening responsibilities of the police department, but should we focus our efforts on more training and more accountability for police departments, but leave funding largely intact? And finally, should we leave departments pretty much as they are? So those are the four questions that we asked our statewide cohort. Let's find out, Claire, what our audience had to say about it. Okay, 2%, only 2% say abolish police departments altogether, and only 1% say leave police departments as they are. So the two more dramatic remedies that have been talked about in public discussion, it's pretty clear to me that most of you reject those more dramatic, perhaps more extreme remedies. 67% of you said, 2/3 of you said, let's shift some funds from the police department to other organizations, but leave the police in control of handling violent crime. And 30%, a little bit less than 1/3, said, let's focus on training and accountability. Well, to a large degree, I'll tell you, or to some degree, excuse me, your responses are very similar to those of the broader community. 12% of Californians said that we should leave police departments as they are. Only 6% said we should abolish police altogether. But on those two more measured approaches, the state as a whole took a slightly different approach than you guys did. 45% said that we should focus as a state on more training and accountability measures, but pretty much leave police funding where it is. And only 32%, still a sizable plurality, talked about making reforms to police departments that would shift significant amounts of their funding to other agencies, but maintain their role in handling violent crime. Interesting, of the four racial and ethnic groups surveyed, whites, blacks, Latinos, and Asian Pacific Islanders, only Black Californians, only African Americans said that shifting funding from the police department to other agencies was a greater priority than training and oversight. And so the African American community in California largely reflected the priorities of this audience. Then we went on, we asked some broader questions of our group, both in February and again in June, July, broader questions about race relations in the state. And of course, just as a reminder, we asked these questions before the pandemic and before the protests, and then again after those events had all taken place. So let's put up once again the question for you that we asked everybody in our statewide survey, and we'll see how your responses compare. Claire, can we put up the second question? There we go. All right. How would you assess relations between people of different races in the state of California? Excellent, good, fair, or poor? Now, we also asked this question of our respondents. We asked them to assess race relations at a national level, where they were very, very skeptical. And we asked the question about race relations in their own neighborhoods, where people were very, very positive. But California came somewhere in the middle, and I'll give you those statistics in a minute, but first let's see what all of you had to say. So what have we got? All right, 0% of you said that race relations in California were excellent. 25%, roughly 1/4, said good. 65% said fair, and 9% said poor. And so let's leave those numbers up for a second if we can, Claire, and then we'll compare them to what we heard back from our overall statewide sample. What I'll tell all of you is when public opinion polling is done with a multiple choice question like this, we usually group together the two positive and the two negative answers. So what we see here is 25% good or excellent. That's not hard math. And 74%, roughly 3/4, leaning negative toward fair or poor. By contrast, in California, we had 41% that said good or excellent when it came to race relations, so somewhat higher than this group, and 54% said fair or poor. But get this, and Claire, if we can leave the numbers up for one more moment, those are June and July responses, a survey taken just a week or two ago, so in roughly the same time frame as your answer. Let's go back to the February responses, because back in February, we found that 57% of Californians thought race relations were excellent or good, and 41 thought that they were fair or poor. So there was a 13-point drop in the positive responses and a 13-point increase in the negative responses over the course of the events of the spring. And what we found digging deeper is that shift was based largely on a very noticeable awareness of discrimination toward racial minorities among white Californians. But to close this out on a slightly more positive note, we asked our respondents also if they felt the protests that followed in the aftermath of Mr. Floyd's murder. We asked them if we thought the protests here in California and elsewhere brought people of different races together. And on that question, even for those respondents who thought race relations were fair or poor, most Californians felt by a 56-31 margin that the protests did begin the process of bringing us together. So that is somewhat encouraging news. Let's go on to our third topic. And of course, we can come back to that conversation, if you like, when we talk again, when we open this up to questions in just a few minutes. But one more topic I'd like to cover with you before we do broaden this conversation. And that topic, as Kim mentioned, is the America First campaign, isolationism on the campaign trail. Now, I know what most of you are thinking, that I'm going to talk now about Donald Trump and building walls and picking fights with the rest of the world, and that's part of the discussion. But what I also want to do is talk about a speech, a really important speech, that Joe Biden gave last week in which he laid out his economic agenda. Now, Trump, of course, has been an avowed protectionist for decades. And although his anti-trade tendencies were overshadowed during the 2016 campaign by the things he was saying about immigration, he's consistently, over his time in office, worked to pull back on the U.S.'s trade involvement with in Europe and Asia and other parts of the world. Now, we've talked about this before, about how this trend toward isolationism seems to be most dominant within the bases, the most extreme voices in both political parties. Trump and his allies on the left, on the right, tend to be much more isolationist. And on the left, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and other more progressive voices from the Democratic base tend to be somewhat more protectionist as well. But it's always been assumed that these arguments for economic nationalism have been based within the most extreme voices in both parties. And that's why Biden's speech last week, in which he laid out his economic agenda, was so notable. So Biden's no isolationist. He's emphasized throughout the campaign the importance of renewing diplomatic engagement throughout the world. During his time in the Senate and as vice president, he personally has spent a tremendous amount of time developing relationships with leaders from other countries around the world. And while he has sometimes been more and sometimes less in favor of U.S. military engagement abroad, he's not reflexively opposed to it. So Joe Biden, over the last 40 years, by any traditional measure, is very much the globalist. But let's look at his speech, and I'd encourage those of you who didn't read about it to look it up after we finish today's program. He goes, what was striking about Biden's economic speech 1 week from today was its emphasis on protectionist-leaning philosophy that I would argue would see much more at home in a Trump or Sanders campaign than in the words of Barack Obama's vice president. So Biden, he talked about expanded government spending on domestic products and strengthening U.S. supply chains, which are both understandable and appropriate measures to take during a time of pandemic. But Biden also called for strengthening requirements for buying American goods and for closing loopholes that make it possible for domestic purchasers to buy overseas more easily. Now, since the central premise of free trade is that a competitive international marketplace lowers costs, these actions would almost certainly increase prices for American companies and consumers. Biden also talks about, in this speech, about a deprioritization of current trade negotiations, most notably the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the multinational Pacific Rim Trade Agreement, which Barack Obama had fought for in office, and from which Trump withdrew shortly after he was sworn in. The policy outline that Biden's campaign released in conjunction with the speech emphasized that Biden, their words not mine, Biden wants a resurgence in US markets before engaging in new trading agreements overbroad. Before engaging in new trade agreements overbroad. That sounds like a hard stop to me, because normally a globalist viewpoint from the Democratic or the Republican Party would talk about new trade agreements being part of a US economic resurgence, not something to follow it. Biden's advisors also made it clear that any future version of the Trans-Pacific Partnership would require substantial reworking from the proposal that Biden himself supported as vice president. Now, I'm not bringing this up to bash Biden or Trump for that matter. They're both very talented politicians, and they both understand that the country as a whole has become much more isolationist and much more protectionist over the last several years. The fight for votes in the industrial Midwest will be just as intense this fall as was the case 4 years ago. The two candidates will spend a lot of time accusing the other one of being soft on China. And if Biden's elected, he'll work, obviously, to reassert the U.S. presence on the international stage in many fronts. He's committed to rejoining the Paris Climate Accords, and he's indicated a more aggressive role for the United States in international anti-COVID efforts. But when it comes to the economy, Biden's approach appears to be a very decisive pivot away from Clinton and Obama era internationalism. So Trump and Biden are very different people in many, many ways. And I bring this up again, not to criticize either, but simply to note that as the American people become more suspicious of international economic engagement, it shouldn't surprise us when the two parties' major candidates decide that that's the path that they want to follow as well. So 3 important topics, but let's do this. I've been talking long enough. So Jessica, if you're around, maybe you can join us and we can hear what the rest of our participants have to say today.
I am around. Good to see you. Happy Thursday.
You too.
All right. The first question is, what are your thoughts on the Trump administration shifting control to coronavirus hospital data from the CDC to Health and Human Services?
All right. So for those of you who didn't see the news, it's just out yesterday, and it's probably the other main COVID-related headline that we could have talked about in the opening. So I'm very glad that the questioner raised it. The Trump administration says that the CDC's online apparatus is insufficient to collect the tremendous amount of data from hospitals around the country when they report in on new COVID cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. And in fact, there is this considerable time lag that takes place when the information comes into the CDC before it becomes publicly available. But there are widespread suspicions from throughout the health community and the much broader community of relevant observers as well, that this is an effort on the part of the Trump administration to maintain control over critically important information about the spread and the progress of the virus. And there's great concern and great fear that if that information is in the hands of political appointees rather than the CDC staff, that the information could be released selectively, delayed, or even released in a misleading basis in order to affect public opinion about progress on the virus. Now, it's important to state that we don't know at this point whether that is what the Trump administration intends or not. But while there are certainly technological insufficiencies at CDC in the way this data is gathered, there is notable worry that heading into the home stretch of these fall elections, that the ability of the government to control what Americans know and don't know about the spread of the virus is something that shouldn't be presented in a political manner, needs to be done in a more even-handed manner above politics. And the concern is that will not be the case as this shift takes place. That doesn't mean that we won't have information, reliable information about the disease from independent sources. There's no shortage of nonprofits, of academic institutions, and others who work very hard to collect and to analyze this data. But the CDC has historically been looked at as the most reliable platform for that discussion dissemination, and that is a potential matter of concern going forward, considerably so.
Thank you. Did Trump's statements on wanting faster reopening harm his standing with Latinos and African Americans who have a higher risk of dying from COVID-19? Or do they support him urging reopening since they are disproportionately economically affected and particularly by school closures?
Look, Donald Trump was not receiving a great deal of support from African American and Latino voters before the virus, and he is still not receiving great amounts of support from either community. There has not been a noticeable shift, either positive or negative, either an increase or decrease in his level of support from these communities, but it is important to recognize how low it started. As I said earlier, our polling shows that minority voters from communities of color, tend to be much more pessimistic about whether we've seen the worst of the virus yet or whether the worst is yet to come. Certainly nothing the president has done to date has increased his support in these communities. I don't know that there was a great deal of room for it to go down. 2 quick points, though, more broadly beyond the virus on voters of color and the president. One, the president has periodically, and his team have periodically, made great efforts to reach out to African American voters, particularly younger African American males. And in fact, a political action committee supporting Trump put out advertising online this week criticizing Biden for what they argue is his very suspect record on race relations. The Trump campaign does not believe that they can win a majority or even a sizable plurality of the African American vote, but they recognize that in very closely contested battleground states, a shift of even 1 or 2% of the votes in states with large minority populations could make a significant difference and create an added advantage for Trump. Finally, worth noting is that while African American voters support Biden in overwhelming numbers, his support in the Hispanic American community is actually somewhat less than Hillary Clinton's was in 2016. This may be the residue of the 2020 presidential primary, in which Bernie Sanders was so successful at attracting Latino and Latina support. But one of the Biden campaign's most important goals going forward is to increase its support from this critical voting bloc, because right now they're not where their need is as strong as their lead in the polls is now. The Biden campaign support from Latino and Latina voters is not where it would need to be in a closely contested election.
Thank you. What about healthcare costs? What are the implications for African Americans and Latinos? How will it impact white people?
Well, of course, the pandemic does not respect geographic boundaries. It does not respect political boundaries, and it does not respect demographic boundaries. And so if a person of more challenging economic means, regardless of their racial or ethnic status, contracts the disease because they live in overly crowded housing circumstances, because they have an essential job that exposes them to the disease to a much greater degree than those who can telecommute, because they spend more time out in the community because of those professional requirements, the potential for spread is considerable. That's one of the main reasons that Robert Redfield was so emphatic earlier this week, saying if we just wear masks, nothing else, but if every single one of us wears masks, we could be past this in 4 to 8 weeks. At this point, just over half of the states in the country now mandate mask wearing in public. But that means there's an awful lot of states that don't. And that is still the most considerable obstacle going forward, regardless of racial or ethnic or any other demographic status.
Thank you. The Economist magazine has a statistical analysis of the November election showing Biden having a 92% chance of winning the Electoral College in November. A Quinnipiac poll this week shows Biden with a 15-point lead. Can this be believed?
Of course, polls can be believed. You can believe that polls are presenting a relatively accurate snapshot of the electorate at the time they're taken. But that's much, much different than believing that a poll taken in July is going to reflect what the political landscape looks like in November. So one of the things we've talked about in this webinar before is that the most important thing to look at when you're examining poll numbers is not the raw numbers. And so whether the Quinnipiac poll shows Biden with a 15-point lead, whether the Wall Street Journal poll shows him with an 11-point lead, whether other polls showed him with other leads in the high single or low double digits, the specific size of those margins is not what's important. What's most critical is not the absolute number, but rather the trajectory, the trend line. And what we see in the Quinnipiac poll that the questioner mentioned, the Wall Street Journal poll also out today, and other recent polling, is that in virtually every national poll that's been taken over the last few weeks, it shows Biden's lead increasing by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points, depending on the survey, over the last several weeks. State by state polling has showed similar trends. In many of the battleground states, in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Florida, the polls are very close. Biden either showing a very small lead or in some a slightly more sizable one. But once again, the most important thing for all of you when you see a poll in the newspaper or online is see what that sponsoring agency, whether it's the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or CNN or whoever it happens to be, look for their previous polling. Look for how they polled a month, 2 months, 3 months ago. There's no question that Biden's margins are increasing at this point, which tells us that he is in a position of considerable political strength. But once again, to go back to the premise of the question, while that can be an accurate snapshot of the current environment, polls are not intended to be predictive. And while it's a natural temptation for us to try to project into the future, that's not what these polls are designed to do. So take them as a reflection of the present as opposed to what we might see in 111 days.
Yeah, were the polls kind of similar in 2016 in terms of predictions? Because obviously that was highly favoring Clinton, and then of course we know the outcome.
So it's interesting. At this point in the summer, Clinton was building up a lead, not to this, but not to this margin. And one of the biggest changes between 2016 and 2020, it's a really smart question, Jessica. One of the biggest changes is among voters who disapprove of both candidates. Now, naturally speaking, if a voter likes one candidate and dislikes the other, or thinks favorably of one and unfavorably of the other, it's almost certain that they're going to vote for the one they think favorably of. What becomes interesting in a campaign like this is what do voters do who support both candidates, who think favorably of both candidates? And I know this is not going to surprise you, but in 2020 America, there are very, very, very few voters who think highly of both Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And so most importantly, then the question becomes, what are the voters who don't like either candidate do? In 2016, even when Trump was losing over the summer at this point in July and August, he was still winning among those voters who disliked both candidates. And he ultimately ended up winning that cohort by not quite, but almost 20 points in the high teens. Today, by contrast, voters who dislike both candidates or who think of both candidates unfavorably support Joe Biden by an even larger margin of between 25 and 30 points, depending on the poll that you look at. So one of the challenges for Trump's comeback is that as the incumbent, he's going to have a very, very difficult time convincing voters who already think poorly of him and are voting for his opponent to switch to him. That's not to say that it can't be done. He's broken most conventional political rules in the past. But it is, to me, one of the most important distinctions between this year's polling and 4 years ago, those so-called double haters that elected Donald Trump 4 years ago just to institute some kind of change, are shying away from him this year in pretty noticeable percentages.
Yeah, and 100 days doesn't feel that long, but we keep having those October surprises. I think that's when the Hollywood Access tape came out in 2016, was in October. So it'll be interesting to see what your talks in October, what surprises we have in store.
Well, the Hollywood Access tape, James Comey, no shortage of other big breaking news. And you're right, we're not quite at 100 days. I think that's
Just
not
a
this
little over.
weekend, but a week from this weekend. So one of the things we'll do in next week's webinar, for those of you who are able to join us, is while we'll be a few days away from it, we'll probably be at about 103, 104 days. One of the topics we'll address next week is to take a look at the 100-day marker. And more broadly than we've done in some weeks, take a step back to take a look at the campaign from a more distant perspective, to give us some broader context heading into the last 100 days of campaigning before the election.
Yeah, great, thank you. Can't one look at Biden's speech as an overture to Republican voters dissatisfied with Trump?
Well, I think you can look at almost every Joe Biden speech as an overture to Republican voters who are unhappy with Trump. This one in particular, I think the questioner makes a lot of sense. Again, one of the things that drove Trump's election in 2016, both over internationalists like Hillary Clinton, but also in the Republican primary, over globalists like Marco Rubio and John Kasich and Jeb Bush, was his understanding that the electorate was turning inward and was becoming more isolationist more broadly and more protectionist when it came to trade and economic matters. So there is a pretty decent sized segment of Republican voters who might not love Trump, but who are wary of more aggressive and more proactive international engagement. Biden's speech, I suspect, is designed to some degree, as the questioner suggests, to reach out to those voters, but even more so to reassure voters that are part of a traditional Democratic base that Clinton lost 4 years ago. Working class voters in industrial states who are very suspicious of international trade agreements. This is Biden's effort to win them back by reassuring them that he's going to protect their jobs from foreign interference. And once again, it might not be as an overt appeal to protectionist impulses, but for those who look at that speech carefully, that's sure what it sounds like.
Thank you. And as a follow-up to that, how successful do you think Biden will be in getting independent and Republican voters to support his ideas about a green economy which is based less on oil and gas?
This is a potential challenge for Biden, but I would say with the possible exception of public safety and crime issues, which Trump is working very hard already to use to separate Biden from swing voters, discussions over the environmental and alternative energy sources is one, once again, in those upper Midwestern battleground states, that presents a real challenge for Biden. For Biden, and for Trump for that matter, discussion about green technology is a trade-off. Those working class voters I was talking about a moment ago, they're somewhat suspicious of those kind of shifts because they live and work in economies that to a large degree are still very dependent on fossil fuels. That said, there's a growing number of suburban voters who until 2016 were very loyal Republicans, who have become more and more supportive of more aggressive anti-climate change measures and other types of alternative energy proposals. It's worth noting that House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who'll be joining us next month for one of our programs, has laid out a Republican agenda for climate change that is not nearly as aggressive as the Democratic proposal, of course. But it's recognition of congressional leadership that they can't ignore that issue altogether, particularly as it relates to suburban voters who have been supportive of Republicans in the past. So once again, Trump used this issue along with others to appeal to white working class voters in 2016. Biden probably doesn't win those voters back by talking as aggressively he did about a green tech agenda, but there are other voters available to him primarily those with college educations, living in the suburbs who voted for Republicans in the past, who he may be able to bring over as a result of these kind of proposals. It's also an excellent way of Biden to motivate his Democratic base, that many Democrats, particularly younger Democrats, are not all that excited about Biden. And to hear him talking in such an expansive way about fighting climate change might be a way of encouraging them to be more likely to participate in the fall.
Thank you. On the topic of globalism, this person asks, over and above political mood, hasn't the pandemic shown major economic weaknesses and loss of skills associated with global economic structure we have created over the past decades? Don't we have a need to rethink the global economic structure so that this country is not completely dependent on overseas supplies?
And the questioner is exactly right about this. And this is something that Biden did attempt to address in his speech, and something that the Trump administration has talked about also. It became very clear at the outset of the pandemic that because over the years, it has become so much less expensive to rely on manufacturing from overseas than from domestic American-based manufacturing facilities, that a great deal of our supply chain has moved out of this country to other parts of the world. And both Trump and Biden, with varying degrees of emphasis, are talking about the need to assert more US control. So when we are looking for masks, for other types of protective equipment, at some point in the hopefully not too distant future for vaccines and other types of medical remedies, having direct access to those products, as opposed to needing to purchase them and transport them from other parts of the world, is a built-in advantage. Now, that does make those products more expensive, but I think there is emerging bipartisan consensus that didn't exist back at the beginning of March, that is something that the US economy needs to do, even if it does mean higher manufacturing costs and ultimately higher consumer costs. So when you look at Biden's speech or Trump's economic agenda, this shouldn't be seen as a black and white internationalist versus isolationist measure, because both sides understand the need to maintain a greater control over the supply chain. But I was struck, as I said earlier, that in addition to that understandable step, that Biden was looking to put articulated need to put the brakes on other US trade agreements as well.
Thank you. How will America be hurt by pulling back from globalism to leave the world stage to China with its current policy financing of infrastructure projects in many underdeveloped countries?
Boy, that may be the most important question on the world stage right now, and could take up the rest of our time today and our whole hour next week. But Jessica, I understand we're devoting a full hour, World Affairs Council Town Hall is, to a discussion of China in the near future. Do you happen to have that information at hand?
We're going to be doing one with Anya Manuel on August 18th, I believe. And she is a great writer and expert on US-China relations, and she'll also be speaking about China and technology. So I think she will most likely be diving into that.
Okay. Well, in the meantime, and I think that sounds like a fascinating conversation, in the meantime, it seems to me that a US retreat from the world stage, whether economically, diplomatically, militarily, or any combination of those, does create a tremendous opportunity for expansion for China that China's already been taking advantage of over the last several years. As we've talked about on this program before, there was an impression, a belief among American opinion leaders in both parties, both Democrat and Republican, for almost a half a century, from the time that Richard Nixon reopened China back in the early 70s until a few years ago. There was a widespread assumption that if we engaged on a goodwill basis with China, that ultimately the international economic environment would encourage the Chinese government to be forced to move toward democracy. And of course, what we're seeing is exactly the opposite. And so the challenge is for the US, for our allies in Europe and elsewhere, is how forcefully do you push back against China? And we're seeing, as it results to Hong Kong, a really unique circumstance, or at least in the Trump era, the US and its Western allies are talking somewhat in unison about China overstepping in terms of its very aggressive actions in Hong Kong. But what does it mean if the US steps back? Well, it means that the Chinese can develop relationships with countries, develop alliances, supporters all over the world. I believe, and I realize it sounds a little bellicose, more than a little bellicose, I believe that the US-China relationship is rapidly devolving into a new Cold War. And as I've mentioned on this program before, the biggest difference between this new Cold War and the one many of us lived through in the second half of the 20th century is that in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, both the US and the USSR worked very aggressively to cultivate relationships with other countries around the world in order to establish a geopolitical advantage over their adversary. Economic relationships, diplomatic relationships, military relationships. And as the US retreats from its historic role on the world stage, what that means is, unlike in the last Cold War, in this one, only one of the two participants is working to form those relationships. And I worry greatly that if the United States does not begin to re-engage internationally on all the fronts that we've talked about, that China therefore develops a considerable advantage economically, diplomatically, and militarily, if only because they're there and we're not.
Yeah, we're also doing a program in September, kind of looking at what the Asian countries that are in the region, how they're perceiving China's rise and how they're feeling about China becoming a superpower. And a lot of those countries are our allies, so got some interesting programs coming up. So we will be touching on a lot of this. So we're glad the questioners are asking about it.
Yeah, and before you go on, Jessica, I think your last point is one worth spending another moment on, and that is the state of the relationships between the US and our historic allies on the Pacific Rim. Mm-hmm. In the last several days, Secretary of State Pompeo issued a very assertive statement regarding the US and China role in the South China Sea, and pushed back much more forcefully, at least in language, than the US government has in a long time about the way the Chinese conducts itself in that region. And I think there was an expectation on the part of the US government that our historic allies in that region would cheer us and line up behind us. And I think such is a state of unease about the reliability of the United States, not just in East Asia, but around the world, that a lot of those countries kept pretty quiet because they were not convinced, it was clear to me, that the US would stand with them to follow up on Pompeo's declaration, and that they didn't want to be seen as taking sides in a back and forth between the US and China. And that, to me, speaks more than anything else of a lack of belief in those quarters about the reliability of the US as a partner going forward.
Thank you. Accounts of some of Twitter's highest profile users, including Joe Biden, Bill Gates, Kanye West, and Elon Musk, were hacked yesterday, but not Trump. If a hacker could gain access to Trump's account, one can only imagine the damage that could be done. Would Trump be helped or hurt if he couldn't continue to tweet?
Well, the president's strongest allies believe that he would benefit greatly from laying off the Twitter account, whether it was something he did because of an outside force or voluntarily. One of the things that appealed to many disaffected voters about Donald Trump as a candidate in 2016 was his unpredictability, which many of them translated as authenticity. He wasn't just another politician. But particularly at a time of crisis, like we're facing with the pandemic, like we're facing economically, like we're facing in the increasingly heightened discussion over race relations in this country, I think unpredictability becomes a less valuable tool for a leader, because more and more voters are looking for predictability and reliability. And Trump's Twitter account is almost by definition, an unpredictable means of communication. And so many of his supporters have been trying for some time now, both quietly and publicly, to urge him to lay off. The hack of Twitter yesterday and what that represents is a really frightening concept, because where I thought the questioner was going is, imagine someone, a rogue force, taking over the president's Twitter account on election day or at a time of increasing of increased international tension and the real world consequences. It's not a good thing if Bill Gates asks you to donate $100 to a Bitcoin account, but the political, the geopolitical, the real world states of world leaders having their public platforms hijacked is a matter of great concern and probably a conversation for another day. But it speaks, if anything, to the importance of those of us who do engage heavily in social media to use it as a source of information as opposed to our primary source of information.
Yeah, it's a good thing they were more greedy and not as malicious as they could have been.
At least for now.
Exactly. How do you think the replacement of Brad Parscale with Bill Stepien as Trump's campaign manager will impact the going forward trajectory of his campaign?
Well, I suspect that many of you saw this, that yesterday Donald Trump did not fire, but demoted his campaign manager and brought in a man by the name of Bill Stepien, who'd been a longtime advisor to then New Jersey Governor Chris Christie to serve as his campaign manager. I think two things to think about here. The most important, Jessica, is just like a baseball team never fires its manager when it's in first place, very few political campaigns make changes in their leadership when things are going well. So most importantly, I think this is a fairly clear admission on the president's part, whether he articulates it or not, that he knows that his campaign is not going well, despite public protestations to the contrary. Second, Parscale, while he was known as being very much of a digital wizard, did not have a great deal of political experience. And so Stepien, as someone who's more veteran, might be able to help develop some type of strategic underpinning for the Trump reelection campaign that, frankly, I don't think has existed to date. But that said, as all of us know, Donald Trump is his own campaign manager. And whether Parscale or Stepien or you or I, Jessica, serves in the title of campaign manager for Donald Trump, ultimately he'll be making the decisions on how the campaign should proceed. But I do believe that Stepien's more extensive background in campaign politics is a tactical benefit to the campaign. We'll see whether the candidate and how often the candidate decides to listen to him.
Thank you. How will the accusations of white privilege affect the white vote?
How will accusations of white privilege affect the white vote? Well, I think the president believes, Trump believes, with some justification, according to public opinion polling, that even while this conversation on race relations has progressed across the state and across the country the way it has over the last few months, there is a noticeable increase in the number of white voters who feel alienated, who feel diminished as part of that conversation. And at least part of Trump's approach at this point seems designed to play on those resentments. Whether it affects the outcome of the election or not is something I don't feel qualified to predict at this point. But what I will note is that the white working class voters who we've talked about earlier in today's program and have talked about regularly for the last few months, those are the voters. Not just white voters, but those white voters, working class, in other words, a white voter without a college education, is much more likely to be susceptible to that type of appeal, if only because that working class voter is less likely to be economically successful and economically secure. When you're feeling stress and pressure, you look for someone to blame. And a working class voter struggling through a time of pandemic and recession could be looking for a scapegoat. And there are elements of the Trump campaign message that do appeal to those sentiments. I don't know that it swings the election. And the reason for that is that the public opinion polling is also showing is that while white working class voters, at least some segment of them, are open to that type of appeal, white voters with a college education, white suburban voters who have been shifting away from Trump in droves over the last couple of years, they're less likely to look to lay blame on other racial or ethnic communities. And so while it's a strategy that has worked in the past, it appears that the percentage of the overall white voter cohort that would buy into it is a lot smaller than it used to be. That's not to say that it can't work for Trump, but he does have a smaller target audience for that message than would have existed 4 years ago or previously.
Thank you. Congress is about to approve a new billion-dollar jobs bill. State spending on COVID-19 will eventually have to be reimbursed by the federal government. Where is this money coming from? Are they printing new money?
The short answer is yes. So the U.S. Federal deficit was increasing dramatically even before the pandemic, and since then to an even greater degree. And the common assumption among most leaders of both parties is that just like in wartime, some deficit spending is desirable in order to meet the urgency of the current situation. The same dynamic should hold here. There's no question that the size of the deficits are increasing at an unprecedented rate. One quick point I'll make, and then maybe we can jam in one more question. The questioner referenced $1 trillion relief package. Well, that may or may not be, because the Republicans are proposing a $1 trillion relief package. The Democrats, as most of you know, in the House earlier this spring passed a roughly $3 trillion relief package. And so when Congress comes back into session next week, look at Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell arguing over any number of disagreements between the two parties about how to proceed. But the sheer size and scope of the relief package is item number one.
Thank you. What do you think of what I would characterize as the strange Ivanka advertising approach to find something new message to 40 million unemployed Americans?
Ivanka Trump is helping to lead a White House effort with many private sector leaders and CEOs to try to encourage unemployed Americans to look for jobs outside of their previous field. In other words, if you lost your job in the pandemic and it's not coming back, this is designed to help you look into other areas besides where you'd worked before. The efforts come under some criticism because Ivanka Trump herself she and her business have benefited greatly from her father, from his financial resources, and from his contacts. And the criticism is, with some justification, that maybe she's not the best person to reassure an unemployed American about how to look for work going forward. That said, any administration, Republican or Democrat, that's willing to engage in a public-private partnership in order to create more easily identifiable pathways for unemployed Americans to develop new job skills and identify new job opportunities is something that we ought to commend. But again, I can see the concern that Ms. Trump herself might be a less ideal spokesperson for that effort than someone who's made their own professional success some other way.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, the idea of having the private sector offer more training and helping, to provide that source, because we do need that right now. You don't want to shoot the messenger. It is something that the country needs.
I was also going to hold up a can of my favorite beans today, but I decided that would be inappropriate.
What is your favorite brand?
Actually, I will admit I was going to hold up, we were talking about this last night, instead of holding up baked beans, I was going to hold up M&M ice cream sandwiches, which are my favorite food. And while I don't think I'm allowed to technically endorse, that would be my recommendation, Jessica. They're about
we can get them as a sponsor.
They're about as unhealthy as they sound, but well worth it.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much, Dan. Kim, I'm going to turn this conversation back over to you.
M&M ice cream sandwiches. This is great.
Wouldn't have predicted.
That took me aback. Thank you for a wonderful, excellent discussion, as usual, on so many critical issues. Can't wait till we have next week's discussion. And as Jessica and Dan have highlighted, we have just a terrific lineup of programs for you over the summer. In addition to Senator Tim Scott, we have Alex Padilla, General John Allen, the president of the Brookings Institute, Alex Padilla, numerous ambassadors from countries that have been impacted politically and economically by the COVID. So please go to lawac.org, register for our programs. Please make a donation, become a member, become a sponsor of a program. We can't do this without your help. We want to have this continuing quality programs and politics in the time of coronavirus going on strongly. So please, everybody, stay safe, stay informed, and we hope to see you soon next week. Dan, thank you again. That was terrific. I'm going to